The intervention in Iraq was couched in very benign terms. The intervention in Libya was couched in benign terms. I could give you 100 interventions where the justification, objectively speaking, was on the basis that there was evidence either of genocide or evidence. I'm sitting in Rwanda. The international community stood by as the genocide against the Tutsi happened. Yet in the same year, they were intervening in West Africa. The construct of benign and malign is controlled and related to the question of narrative and strategic self-interest. We've often not paid enough attention, and thank you, Chairperson of the African Union, for educating us on how the international fora of decision-making, the Security Council, and other fora, including at some stage how we transact within the International Criminal Court and other platforms. That evidence, and that was my point, we don't control data, we don't control digital platforms, we therefore are not controlling narrative in both analog and digital forms. What can practically be done? We do need to speak to Europeans, not as victims, because the erasure of the contribution in European consciousness of Africans to modernity and civility has constructed a white supremacist view that sees the evolution of modernity as a singularly European contribution. And it is only now that our young researchers are beginning to excavate the contributions of black people, of Africans, towards inventions. Because until now, the province of economy was not the province of black people. In my country, in Zimbabwe, when land was taken, a British court gave a judgment that said, the question before them and who owned the land, they said, one thing is certain, it cannot be the native because the native has no sense of ownership. It was on that basis that land was taken. Number two, on the question of economics, even we pejoratively only talk about our people as informal law, informal economy, yet the informal economy is formal. That's how India developed through its cottage industry. That's how we have a psychotic addiction to colonial definitions of what, and that's why Professor Ashraf is correct. It's not just a narrative about our contribution historically, it's a narrative about our contribution now. Our young people who developed M-Pesa, which is now being used globally, who developed Ushahidi, which has been used by over 300,000 organizations, including the Japanese, the US military, and the NATO forces, are never sufficiently credited. Why? Because it is not in the current psyche of most Europeans possible that Africans are anything else except the object of charity that deserve our mercy and our pity. Why? Because they are governed by tyrants, right? Or Africans are incapable of ethics. And we've constantly said that Switzerland, which received the Abacha loot, which received the loot from the then Zaire and now DRC, has constantly been ranked in anti-corruption indices as the cleanest country in the world. PLO and I are lawyers. The receipt of stolen property is theft at law. How is it that you will have Nigeria and Kenya ranked so far, and yet the country that receives the money ranked so up? I think that if you're changing narrative, you also have to change behavior. Our African leaders and citizens constantly confirm the European caricature, an object of pity. When we come into this spaces, we can never transact revolution in courtesy. I like to be civil, to be courteous, right? But each time I start pointing to atrocities committed by African governments, the Europeans and the Americans cheer me up. Each time I refer to the historical atrocities and continuing atrocities committed first by governments and by companies that are dumping cyanide into our underground water and nuclear waste, right? You know what it is said? This is retrogressive. It's undermining investment. It's listen, we cannot win the narrative battle by arguing in pockets. They are happy us talking about our localized, indigenized oppression. They are never happy us talking about the question of distribution and redistribution, of the global economy, of global power. And what Nkrumah and others realized in 1963 at the founding conference, if Africa is not represented, if Africa does not own its narrative, but you can't own your narrative if your leadership is totally disconnected from its people. You can't own your narrative if your intellectuals are totally disconnected. We have underinvested in rural areas and slums where the majority of our people are. In fact, we treat them as security threats and they are over-policed. Number two, we have underinvested in our academic and research institutions. We'd rather bring McKinsey and bring Deloitte and Touch. They will help us do AU reform. Why? Because there are no African consultancies that we know. Even if they exist, we have no relationship with them to help us with AU reforms, with anything else. And this is not a pronouncement on McKinsey or Deloitte. It's a pronouncement on ourselves. We have not, as a leadership, begun to recognize that the native is capable of knowledge. The native is capable of economy. The native is capable of invention. You can't change the narrative if the starting premise is we're trying to be like Europe and to catch up. We can't change the narrative when we're constantly trying to learn from others without understanding, and I'll end with that, what William Tunga said, the former Chief Justice of Kenya. He says, let's not engage in this romanticist view that there can only be one way to learn. We first must indigenize knowledge. That's what I said, learn from our culture and traditions. Number two, we must diversify who we learn from. We can not only learn from the West, we need to learn from everybody who has something to teach. Number three, we must domesticate what we learn. If we're going to learn anything, let's domesticate. I think the chairperson and the minister said it's consciousness. Narrative is first and foremost by realizing self-worth, self-belief, and looking inward so that when you look outward, it is to supplement not a vacuous state of nothingness and inferiority, but it is to supplement a very stable, solid foundation where your culture, where your values, where your value for people is important.